Chapter 2. The stewardess asked me if I'd like a little more champagne. I managed to nod casually, though my first impulse was to grab the bottle in case she changed her mind. I was flying first class on a great big superjet. First class? Not only had I never flown first class, I had never known anybody who had. It's nice up there in the front cabin. More space, free booze, and that indefinable feeling of being superior to the hoi polloi. When Hank Honeycutt said expenses, he meant it. He had apologized for not sending his private plane to pick me up. The second glass of champagne made me feel very mellow about good old Hank, and that was just as well, because I had begun to wonder whether I was making a serious mistake. Honeycutt had accepted my credentials with flattering promptness. At least it would have been flattering if I hadn't been fairly sure he was getting desperate. Then came the first-class ticket with an advance on my salary in case I needed to buy anything for the trip. All that was fine. I'd have had only kindly thoughts about my benefactor if I had not spent some time reading up on the crazy theories he had endorsed. After the acceptance letter arrived, I went straight to the library. Not the university library. I knew they wouldn't carry the kind of trashy books I wanted. The public library in town had most of the ones on my list. I found a copy of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in a second-hand bookstore and discovered with astonishment that some paperback company had recently seen fit to reprint Churchward's illiterate essays on the lost continent of Mu. Then I went back to my one-room apartment and baked a double batch of chocolate chip cookies, and took them and the 8-pack of Coke I had picked up on the way home and settled down for an orgy. Of research, that is. At first I enjoyed it. I started with the skeptics like Martin Gardner and Sprague de Camp, men who knew how to write and who did their debunking with humor and devastating sarcasm. They gave good summaries of the crazier cults, from Sims's hollow earth theory to Velikovsky's naive belief that the miracles of the Old Testament were caused by comets whizzing back and forth around the earth at convenient intervals. Some of the ideas were so wild they were funny. I loved Le Plongeon, one of the 19th century explorers of Yucatan who believed that the Mayans had carried civilization to Egypt, Sumer, and elsewhere 11,000 years ago. I particularly adored Queen Mu, pronounced Mu as in cow, a prehistoric and purely fictitious Mayan queen whose brother Ak murdered her husband Ko, so Mu fled to Atlantis. Le Plongeon believed in Atlantis too, and then sailed on to Egypt. She had another brother named K. Ak, Mu, Ko, and K. It suggests a nice vulgar limerick, doesn't it? One of Le Plongeon's proofs that Near Eastern culture and language were derived from the Mayas was his translation of the words Christ said on the cross. I bet you didn't know that Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani doesn't really mean, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? No, what he really said was, in Mayan, now, sinking black ink over nose. I'm serious. At least Le Plongeon was, poor man. Le Plongeon was fun. So was George F. Riffert, who wrote a book called The Great Pyramid, Proof of God. He and some other pyramid mystics thought that one of the bumps on the Great Pyramid of Giza represented the vital date of September 16th, 1936. The only trouble was, 40 years later, he still hadn't figured out what had happened that day, unless it was that the King of England told the Prime Minister he was going to marry Mrs. Simpson. Those ancient Egyptians really did have insight into world history. Charles Russell, the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, also believed that the cracks and bumps in the Great Pyramid foretold what was going to happen in history. According to his calculations, the Second Coming of Christ had taken place in 1874, invisibly. He and a few other selected saints were the only ones who had noticed. After a while, though, I stopped laughing and started to feel a little sick. No, it wasn't the cookies. I can eat incredible amounts of chocolate chip cookies. The crackpots varied in intelligence. From the plausibly pseudo-scientific to the out-and-out moronic, but they had several disturbing qualities in common. The most conspicuous of these was an immense persecution complex. Each and every one of them believed he was a genius, and that everybody else in the whole world was wrong. They were martyrs. Everybody hated them and despised them and refused to listen to them. They were all also incredibly dull. I remembered what a hard time I had had plowing through Velikovsky. He was far more boring than any of my textbooks, and they weren't Gone with the Wind. As I read on, and on, and on, I realized that all these people shared a humorless, frightening paranoia. Buried somewhere in most of the books was a need to justify some fundamentalist religious code. Velikovsky started with the assumption that the books of the Old Testament describe events that actually happened. God knows, at least I hope he does, that I don't want to poke fun at anybody's religious beliefs. But if you start with the idea of proving Holy Writ, it's hard to know where to stop. And biblical fundamentalists, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, or other, tend to be equally dogmatic about other issues, such as the superiority of the descendants of one or the other of Noah's sons. Racism kept rearing its ugly head among the luxuriant vegetation of these imaginary worlds. The superior civilization-bearing citizens of lost Atlantis were almost always tall, blond, blue-eyed Aryans. The Spanish monks, who were the first ones to push the idea that the American Indians were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, pointed out that the Indians, like the Jews, were ungrateful for the many blessings God had bestowed upon them, such as slavery and the Inquisition, I suppose. And Heyerdahl, 300 years later, concluded that only Indians showing Caucasoid, i.e., white traits, were intelligent enough to make the trek across the Pacific to Polynesia. The Negroid types there had been brought as slaves. It wasn't hard to figure out why so many of these people were fascists, open or covert. They were arrogant snobs who thought they were superior to everybody else. They couldn't endure the slightest criticism of their ideas. Racists are arrogant people, too. It left a very bad taste in my mouth, and by the time I was through reading, I was prepared to dislike Hank Honeycutt very much. Not that I decided to give up the grant. Oh, no. I am noble, but I am not that noble. Besides, I figured I could get in some missionary work. Hank seemed to be susceptible to any crazy idea. Why not to mine? Full of champagne and other munchies, I was feeling no pain by the time the plane began its descent over the tortured bare rocks of the northern plateau of Arizona. I knew I might be in for some trouble, though. I could sit and smile and nod while Hank explained to me about colonists from Lemuria and Martians digging the Grand Canyon. A man is entitled to his fantasies. But if he started spouting any of the Anglo-Saxon superiority stuff, I wouldn't be able to keep quiet. It's not a matter of conviction, it's pure reflex. I can't stand that garbage. Oh well, I thought, if we fight, he can fire me. At least I've had a nice trip. Since my mother will not drive more than 500 miles from home, and since classical scholars do not make enough money for expensive vacations, I'd never been west of the Mississippi before. I gawked out the window with unashamed appreciation and curiosity as the plane came into Phoenix. The terrain was utterly different from anything I had seen. Phoenix is a big, sprawling city. There are a few modest skyscrapers downtown, but most of it is low and spread out and surrounded by isolated local mountains. The stewardess pointed out Camelback, which I guess is a well-known landmark. It didn't look like a camel from where I was sitting, but it was an excellent mountain. It was so bare. All the mountains I had ever seen had trees on them all the way to the top. I have forgotten whether I mentioned that the month was June. Most colleges get out earlier than that, but mine ran on the trimester system. We get a long vacation from Thanksgiving to New Year's and run longer in the summer. June isn't the height of the summer in Arizona. It gets a lot hotter in August. The temperature was a mere 90.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.